Hello and welcome to sunny Bordeaux. I'm here to be part of the International Cultic Studies Association 2017 conference, and I'll be giving a talk on the radicalisation of pretend cult-busters. Now that might seem like a bit of a jokey title, but it's very far from funny subject, as you'll find out. We're here because we have been living in the research of this subject for a long time now. But it's the reason that we're at this conference is because it's the extent to which others try to prevent us from coming here that shows why it's important for us to turn up and talk about these issues. So we're looking at radicalisation from this definition here, which is basically a process of adopting increasingly extreme political, social or religious ideas which go against what you might expect and distort society. Now, we're living in a world, obviously, of extremism and it's proliferating. But what we have witnessed is that there's an equal and opposite, in a way, proliferation of rationalism that is coming up. And you may all have this in your country, groups and networks of rationalists and skeptics who purport to be fighting these tendencies towards radicalisation. And so this is who we are studying today. Our study group is these networks of skeptics, the humanists, they are rationalists, and they have been creating these networks now for a decade through blogging. They form charities in the UK. There are so many now rationalist charities who have recently launched a threat of legal action on the Charity Commission if they don't get rid of other charities that are alternative medicine. They want them out, so they're taking over that. They hold lots of conferences and seminars, and there's a loose organisation called Skeptics in the Pub, which is now going worldwide, where people get together and talk about skeptic things. They're also very involved in the press. Skeptics are in The Guardian, The Times. They are very influential in BuzzFeed. So they have a kind of grip on our national narrative, and it's growing. Now, they're so rational, this group, that we only came across them at all because we happened to be exiting a cult that we had inadvertently fallen into through school, actually. And it was a school cult, an educational cult. And that's how we came to the attention of a group called the Steiner Critics that I'm popping in there because they also consider themselves to be part of the skeptical view. Now, the Steiner Critics are a loose organisation that is worldwide, and they are in every country where there are Steiner schools because of that form of education. They always attract these critics who take issue with the pedagogy. So these are just a few of them from the United States, in Sweden, France, Canada. And we came across these people when we started publishing about what happened to us at a Steiner school that happened to be in New Zealand. These groups who advertise themselves as rational then first of all, welcomed us as people who had similar experiences of these Steiner schools, but then they started piling in on us and attacking us. And we were able to deal with our situation in New Zealand through the Human Rights Commission, who very bravely took on a process of mediation that resulted in a landmark settlement about what is commonly referred to as unchecked bullying in Steiner schools, which is a form of bullying where it is observed worldwide that when bullying occurs, the staff do nothing. And there's no reason they give for that. So it's hard to work out why they're doing this. But the Steiner critics have lots of theories about it, that it's to do with karmic return. So a bully is somebody that was bullied in a former life. You can't really find this written down anywhere because obviously no school's going to admit that. But when they attacked us about it, they were attacking a situation in which our child, who was 8 at the time, was severely bullied in that school for a number of months. And it culminated in her being threatened with an axe by a boy who, although he was in the same class, was 2 years older than her. And at the point where we had to bring this to the attention of the school, they expelled all of our children. We had 3 children at the school, and blamed us. So here's the Steiner critic who was writing under a pseudonym at the time, saying that it was a courageous thing to do. Here's another Steiner critic from America saying that this unchecked bullying, according to the reports of parents, is the most problematic thing in Steiner-Waldorf education worldwide. And because they have this kind of secretive attitude to why they're not preventing bullying, another critic commented that this is what they tend to do when there's inappropriate or illegal behaviour by teachers, that if it's exposed, which would be 9 times out of 10 by parents, that the school circles the wagons and the child and their parents are treated badly. And this is what happened to us. But these are all critics trying to work this out after the event. Within this literature on Steiner, they did publish in 2009 a description of the main characteristics of the Steiner-Waldorf school. And one marked characteristic of them is, as it says here, that pedagogical methods are used in dealing with discipline. So then that's just a clue, and you have to go down the rabbit hole to find out exactly what that means. But in a school newsletter, a guy called Kim John Payne, who is an educator and a consultant that they use quite a lot in Steiner schools when they have behavioural problems, he said that you denied his or her usual behaviour, that's bullying behaviour, a child may simply become compulsive about something else, like video games. So that the idea is it's unwise to squash a bully or basically to stop them being a bully. So this Steiner critic, who lives in Sweden, Alicia Hamberg, she wrote a blog about Steiner schools. And these are the things that happen to people who try to address this unchecked bullying. Threats, frivolous reports to the police, your child can't see old friends, destruction of property, general smearing, defamation, and risking being dragged into the gutter. And we have experienced all of that. And even at the time, these are comments from local people. They were saying that, the police were called once when a child stayed at our house, that we're mentally ill, this kind of general stuff that you might expect for people doing that. Now, there's quite a well-known Steiner critic in France, GregoirePerra, and he was a teacher in Steiner for many years, and he blew the whistle on it, and they sued him. The Steiner-Waldorf Federation of France sued him for defamation, but with the support of organisation, he won that case. So, it's going on. It's very rarely in the newspapers, but these things are happening all the time. And in Britain, we've got a guy called Andy Lewis, who is a skeptic, and he's been running up and down the country doing talks on Steiner as well as blogging and talking about Steiner. So here he is talking about the karma and the bullying, and the bullying issues in Steiner could be symptomatic of their beliefs in allowing karma to play out, and that you shouldn't take anything for granted when you're talking about them, because they don't say what's really going on. Now, here is the settlement that we achieved through the Human Rights Commission of New Zealand, and I'm not expecting you to read it all, but although the Steiner school didn't say to us, your child was threatened with an axe and then we expelled her because we hate you, if you put these statements together, it is an admission that they did not follow through on their anti-bullying promises, and that instead they turned on us, they expelled her. And it is a description of exactly the same thing that is reported around the world. And we're proud to have been able to do that, and also proud of the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, because Steiner education is a subject that's so controversial that when we first tried to bring it here, we were told that we couldn't talk about it. And in the press in New Zealand, we were on television in New Zealand, we were in the press, because we were told that nobody had ever taken a school on. It's very hard to do that there. So I want to go back now to radicalisation, because when I'm looking at radicalisation, I want to look at these 4 elements without which I don't think radicalisation can occur. And the first one is grooming. In order to groom people, you must exploit their vulnerability to engender trust. Then there's the inculcation, which is the idea that you're going to put in their head once you've made them trust you. And then after you've done that, you need to monitor them, because otherwise the idea might fall out. So there's a monitoring aspect to radicalisation. And the other thing, the last thing, which must be there, is an intended harm, because it's not really radicalisation if you're not going to have a result out of it. And so when we're talking about grooming in this way, it's not so much about the idea itself as about how you're going to create the trust in it. And that's very relevant to this talk. And actually, the how to control information and what information is real or false is one of the hottest topics on the planet at the moment. We're living in a world of false news. And so there's been a lot of research into it. And the research, unfortunately, is generally coming out to show that we are hardwired in our brains to double down on misconceptions. So that's looking very good for cults, actually. So here's a few examples. Why facts don't change our minds. This is an interesting article because what it's saying is that the way out of this is by using science, because science doesn't have a my side bias. That when you're doing science, it's empirical, you're looking at the facts, and it's a kind of corrector for that hardwired problem that we have. Here's another one, that they found that when fake news about the Iraq war was put out, that the most committed participants who had the strongest points of view, when those points of view were corrected, they actually believed in them more. And that wasn't related to who was telling them, it wasn't related to whether there were deaths involved, or it was just something that happened sort of naturally. Another study published in the Journal of Neuroscience, they pinpointed a region of the brain that will respond to the opinions of confident people. Again, that's very good for people who are grooming, because the more confidently you put that idea open. I mean, we know confidence tricksters obviously have been around for a very long time. And here's another one. They found that a charismatic figure, basically your brain will just shut down on skepticism. You just are swept into the cultic adoration of the feeling that somebody's taking control, which is quite scary. And another study by the same person came to this conclusion that there's a mechanism of authority that may facilitate charismatic influence. In this experiment, they got a load of people who were into religion, and they got a charismatic religious speaker, and then they compared it with a load of people that weren't in religion. But what they didn't do was provide a charismatic speaker for them. And if you think about that, they're using those rational people as a control. They're not putting them in the experiment. Perhaps they could have put Richard Dawkins in there and see what happens to the skeptics' brains when Richard Dawkins is on. So at the very least, by that, we can speculate that if you have an unrealistic assumption that you in your group has an innate lack of bias, that's unlikely to lead you to have a solid commitment to examine the bias that might actually be present. I mean, that's basically the least we can say about that. And I found, to try and explain how come a group of rationalist people could target in the manner that they have, I found this book very interesting. It's a book by Avishai Margaret, and it's called On Compromise and Rotten Compromises. It does deal with huge international political compromises, and plenty of them weigh on violent extremism. But the central definitions are very persuasive and quite relevant here, because it operates on two models of political bargaining. The first of which is economic, and the second one is religious. And he basically says that all political bargaining is coming from one of these 2 points. So in the economic side of it, basically where you have an economic way of trying to work stuff out, everything is negotiable because you can count it. So it's out there, you can look at it, and it can be shared out. On the other hand, if you have a religious picture, then the holy is non-negotiable. So religiosity is convinced of itself, it brooks no dissent, and it also tends towards sectarianism, or what is otherwise known as the narcissism of minor differences. None of that is probably news to anybody that has studied cults. But here are the Steiner critics demonstrating sectarianism. The same Steiner critic who said that unchecked bullying is pervasive in Steiner then said to us, you represent the Westboro Baptist Church of Waldorf critics, which, what a ridiculous idea that is. So I want to look first of all at the grooming. We've discovered that rationalists may be vulnerable to grooming because they have an unrealistic assumption of their own lack of bias, and that does create a vulnerability. We ourselves were vulnerable because, first of all, I'm physically disabled. Secondly, we were leaving this cult. And the third thing that happened at the time when this happened was that my mum was dying, and she suddenly had a shock kind of diagnosis of lung cancer, and she was dead within a year. So we were travelling and we came over here, and there she is. First of all, the first grooming then was done to us by the Steiner critic who threw herself at us, and we had offers coming out of our ears, wanted me to write about Steiner education because Michael Gove was about to make it state funded in the UK, invited us to stay with her, tried to help find us an alternative school if we wanted to return to the UK. It was overwhelming. And the second element of the grooming was to unknown amounts of other people, which happened after she'd groomed us and we got into trouble with that. Then she started grooming other people. And she did that by three methods: by persuasion, by coercion, and by threat. So there's this lie that I am a very dangerous person that's been put out very widely in the UK. Coercion, the skeptic going to a talk who said he wouldn't go on if we were allowed in the building. And threat of saying to other people, if you talk to them, you will be ostracised. And this has been going on now for a very long time. So we'll look at one researcher. There's one very rational Steiner critic researcher. And initially, she was very unwilling to join in with this. She said that she felt that it ought to be something that didn't involve other people, and that if this other critic had made some advances to us, that she should sort it out herself. At which point she was informed that I have a borderline personality disorder on the basis of her husband's, who is a mental health professor. And so she was using his credentials to do that. And there you have the word, the danger. The danger is very important because it is because it works. After that, the same rational researcher then became incredibly worried about the French Steiner critic. Does he realise how dangerous they are? So this idea is catching on like wildfire. There's no evidence. She didn't ask to see a clinical judgment. There isn't one. She did nothing. So let's go back to the Swedish Steiner critic. Anyone who complains about Steiner, there must be something wrong with them. They must be disturbed. Anyway, the fault is certainly with them. How did she react to being radicalised? The school certainly has nothing to be ashamed of. In the circumstances, they've acted quite elegantly. And I support the NZ Steiner School. So there you go, she's turned around. When the school, after the settlement, we were in the papers, as I've said, and on television, they published a backward statement retracting what they had signed off on with the tribunal director of the New Zealand Human Rights. As you can see, they're talking about alleged bullying there, whereas actually what it says in the settlement is that they acknowledged that there actually was bullying. So they went back on it because they didn't like the publicity, because there was substantial. So this Steiner critic then saying, oh, as for the illegal letter, I've been happily disseminating that as well. Lots of people have seen it, and I believe that it shows that the school is the more truthful party, which, if you think about it, is impossible, because either they were lying then or before. It doesn't show truthfulness at all. So she was told that this other person now didn't believe that my mother was real, because I didn't talk to her about my mother, because I didn't know her, and it's a private matter because my mother died, you know. So that idea caught on as well. I don't think that she's telling the truth about her mother. And that basically we're serial criminals. Of course, what we're really after was money. And that idea caught on as well. We're terrorising people to get money. She warned the French Steiner critic on Facebook, and she's saying that he thanked her for that. Days after that, a week and a half after that, he said to us that he didn't want to get involved because he didn't really know what was going on. So that was a lie. And then a year later than that, another person just said that he just doesn't want to have any contact with us. Another Steiner critic, who's a Californian one, these are all statements from her showing that she was quite clear about the plausibility of what we said happened at the school, because it happens everywhere, and also the quality of our work when we did some translation from one of Grégoire's articles into English. But she was tipped off by this same person that Angel is not disabled, she's just fat. And at the end of the day is my husband's clinical judgment, which I seem to have forgotten. So this Californian Steiner critic then say, well, now I doubt that she has got a mobility impairment. And can the Human Rights Commission put a gagging order on them? Normally it would be against human rights. But in this case, now here's quite a top British Dr. David Colquhoun. He's well known at London University. He's a skeptic. He's in the Sunday papers often. Quacks are good at using sciencey sounding words, so ask for evidence, he says. She sounds sane, but clearly isn't, he says, without asking for any evidence whatsoever. Follow me for an explanation, that's on Twitter. And then this other quote is from someone else, that he already had been warning other people about me personally. So let's look at another one. This guy who's been running around doing talks, he says that there has to be due weight and scientific and evidence-based views must dominate against conjecture. When he was told that I had a personality disorder, he immediately started referring to us as the personality disorder team. So you can see that these people are very easily radicalised indeed to the idea that goes against everything that they're claiming to believe in. But how far did that go? Well, I've done my very best on Twitter, so many people to write to. I've tried to stop people tweeting their stuff. Andy, that's the guy we've just seen, knows most of the big hitters. That's the top UK journalists. So he's put out a warning. Everyone who needed to know has been informed. And there was a big Guardian Open Festival last weekend, so who knows what got about there. That is the situation that happened to me while my mother was actually dying. So what were the ideas that they were put in their head, apart from being mentally ill, that we're not trustworthy, that we're liars, manipulative, and obviously mad? And there's more of it, that our working methods are bad, Steve is unsafe, we're dangerous serial stalkers. So it wasn't only this behind-the-scenes stuff. There were also several highly humiliating and dismissive pieces of defamation that were published that we had no right of reply to, using our names in the title, as you can see. And that was really difficult. And the idea of that obviously was to provoke us to publish in response, because we couldn't reply to them, in which case then, once you've created this madness, then you just point the finger and look how mad they are. So now to the monitoring and spying, because also, obviously, in order to be able to groom others into bullying, they had to know who we were talking to. So they literally stalked us. Anyone we talked to on social media, they would turn up and go, oh, you don't want to talk to them, or whatever. And so the evidence of their stalking is they knew exactly where we were. Now they're in Paris. It looks like they may be back in Bristol. They went to Venice. This is when we went to Trieste, to ICSA. And this last one here, the hospital will be in Guildford. That was where my mum was dying, that they were stalking us there. So a lot of these things that we're seeing are recognisable as bullying. Bully grooms bystanders and a target to believe that the target deserves the treatment they're getting, and will use their communications to exclude the target so they can't defend themselves. And this is exactly what happened to us in one of the first public mobbings that we endured on a website, where we were very heavily repudiated. This person didn't take any visible part, but she was constantly in the background telling people what to say. And here she is saying exactly that. He must think if only Thetis would appear, he'd be able to defend himself. Because you can't defend yourself against an invisible enemy. There's nobody there. In the end, after we tried to address this through the courts, we had an advisory report by an expert, and his suggestion as to why this happened was that because these critics felt threatened that we turned up, and we're videographers and we were quite good at what we were doing, and he invited the court to see that they didn't like that, and that there was defamation that sparked a campaign of harassment. I'd like to just finish this part of the talk by talking about two particularly pernicious outcomes of this radicalised bullying. In May 2013, just before we came to ICSA in Trieste, we went to a public meeting. We'd moved back from New Zealand because we couldn't address it from out of the jurisdiction, because although you might live in a jurisdiction, the internet doesn't have borders. So what they could do what they like, we could do nothing. So we went to a public meeting of a talk that he was holding about Steiner education, because we figured that's the best place to go. We'll ask him. We had a letter that we wanted to hand to him, which we'd already sent by email, but he blocked our email, to try and avoid taking him to court, because we didn't want legal action. And part of our letter said this to him: Andy, you're a savvy bloke and a canny wordsmith. Let's sort this matter out now through diplomacy. We were trying all the time to wind it down. This is what happened in the pub when we tried to do that.
Ever see you near any of my family or anything like that, I'll call the police.
Your family?
I'll call the police.
We've never been near your family.
So he immediately created this view in front of all these people that we were stalking his family, his children. 2 months later, he wrote to the gang while we were at Trieste: our friends are not just on a jaunt to Venice. Angel is speaking at a conference on cults. So that means that he was smearing us as stalkers because we'd had to cross the world to try and stop him telling lies about us. But actually, he was stalking us at the same time in a networked gang. And while we were at ICSA, this is what was going on. The Swedish blogger was getting really busy. An acquaintance, psychologist and cult expert, saw her. And he's at the conference and he said he spoke to her. This other one said that her mental health husband was going to write to the conference. And Andy Lewis was more worried about if we got anything published. And he said he thought that might be worth putting a stop to. And he's happy to talk to anyone who wants anything checked about us. I mean, he isn't someone I know. And then everyone regroup reports. That was after this little flurry of activity. So that was what was going on at ICSA. So here he is saying Richy's right on the money and will notify the police before the meeting. This was a supposedly open public meeting. And this is talking about Richy Thompson of the British Humanist Association, where they decided they wouldn't let us go to a meeting because he didn't want to answer any awkward questions. So they were going to call the police. This is British humanism at its best. Now, they published a 15-page document on Steiner, which Richy Thompson wrote, and they didn't mention this most problematic issue of unchecked bullying. They were asked by a parent why they'd left it out, and he said, well, I've heard many people say that bullying is an issue in Steiner schools, although it's not something I've looked into. So we contacted them and spoke to this lady, Pavan Dhaliwal, who was the head of public affairs, and she said that they hadn't covered it because it wasn't part of the ideology or the pedagogy of Steiner. The chief executive said he believed that I was an erratic obsessive and that they were just trying to ignore me. Very shortly after that, there was a segment on Newsnight, which is one of our main political programmes, late night programme, where Andrew Copson, same guy, went on saying, the reason that we tried to get these documents they released is precisely because we feared what they turned out to actually contain, which is that the quasi-religious, pseudo-scientific, mystical belief system was linked directly to incidents of racism and bullying. They were preparing that while they were fobbing us off, quite apart from misleading the country about the nature of bullying in Steiner education, which is a serious thing to do. If organisations like the British Humanists can be so easily radicalised by a few people claiming to be skeptics, then individual people who are being threatened don't really stand a chance, do they? And a question I've got about this, when you see these fine networks of skeptics, is if they're not doing what they say they're doing, if they're not being skeptical, if they're not being humanist, why are they doing it? Why are they building these charity networks? Something's going on. So I just want to look at the intended harm or the effects on targets. Now, the effects of ostracisation, having been studied now, are said to be unbearable. And they're unbearable not only on the people who are targeted, but they do affect the perpetrator of it, because it's a basic human need to be included and to feel like you're belonging. So a guy called Kip Williams has been doing some study of it, and he's found that frequent exposures to ostracism make targets become depressed, helpless, and engage in suicidal ideation and or attempts. And the most emotionally damaging type of bullying is being left out. and that memories of ostracism can resurface and cause pain in the future, so that can come back. In this course of conduct, we've got the ostracisation bit is this bit here, which we call a stop, because a stop is put on public communication. And the way they do that is by publishing these articles where there's no right of reply and never taking advantage of a right of reply to any publication of ours. So there's no discussion. And that's the end of any discussion. Then they can defame away either quietly in the background or loudly. And then the stalking is very important. And there's an overt and a covert attitude to that, because on Twitter, say, for example, somebody who isn't one of these main players would come, and they still do it, and warn people off talking to me. Don't talk to her. That happens to me all the time. But that's only the surface. I know that underneath, they are organising to make sure that nobody has anything to do with me as well. We've called the course of conduct Stop Defamation by Stalking. We are committed to making sure that people do know about this, because we're sure that we're not the only people that are being subjected to it. So the effects of Stop Defamation by Stalking include the effects of ostracisation, obviously the public lies that are written about you with no right of reply, the knowledge that people are writing hidden lies, and the fact that although a lot of the public lies say these people aren't worth spending any attention on, that you know that underneath that you are under constant surveillance as well. So that's quite exhausting. So what remedies are there for this? Well, it happens that in 2012, as a response to the rise in cyberbullying, cyber harassment, which all countries and governments are struggling with now because it's so massive, what's happened with the internet, they did bring a new section into the Protection from Harassment Act in the UK, which was an act that was made in 1979. And it's a new section which is designed entirely for courses of conduct that have this cumulative targeting and networked element to it. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to benefit from any of that because the authority misunderstandings about this subject are rather enormous. For example, we were told by the police that you can't be harassed if you don't know it's happening. They said that there's a 6-month statute on the offence of harassment, which this new section it means is not true, because it can either be summary or indictment, which means that it can be over a period of time. And that what they said was, the police told us that if a mental health professor is smearing you, you must complain to their boss. Whereas what the judge had said to that when they went to court was, the target's wrote to the boss of the mental health academic trying to get him to lose his job. So they're not, they don't match up at all. The judge said that against the scientific evidence, that it was extraordinary to say that a silence could be aggressive. Obviously hasn't read the science on ostracisation at all. And as far as the harassment, not being harassment if you don't know about it, Baroness Hale was very clear that it can. So as you can tell, we haven't succeeded very much in the courts. And the reason for that is because although the judge could see this was our case, we tried to reintroduce this claim once we had all this information during the court case, that the claim was of harassment of covertly inciting organisations and individuals to shun us by saying we were dangerous and mentally unstable. And he could see lots of candidates for it. His response was to refuse that amendment. So we were not trying that. And he said that he would be able to look at it through a defamation-only case. But when it came into court and we tried to push that point, he said that he was not trying any case that was about deliberate collusion in setting the hounds upon you. And the upshot of that is that we lost our home, and our children lost their home, and we lost it really based on some quite atrocious judicial literary criticism, because it was only about what was visibly what we'd written in response to what they'd written, but he removed the provocation. So he ended up getting really cross with us. And the main reason that he got cross with us was because we insisted that we had been groomed. And we were not allowed to say that, so we were punished by losing our home. The school is still in New Zealand. We've obviously lost our New Zealand life and we're now back in Swansea. The school still advertises itself as a safe, peaceful and natural learning haven. And people go there. It attracts quite a lot of immigrants, so there's always new recruits coming to it. But we recently got communicated with by some people in Auckland who got in touch with us about the boy who had threatened our daughter with an axe. Well, what happened to him was that after we were summarily dismissed from the school, after a short time later, he was moved from that school. There was nothing happened to him. He had no behavioural sanctions whatsoever, but they moved him to another school. And so what they rang up to tell us was that he's now up on 3 rape charges because he raped 3 girls at that school. So 9 years after our children were expelled, when he threatened one of them with an axe, he has now been formally expelled. Obviously, he was underage when he committed those rapes, and the case is under name suppression. Or we would never talk about his name anyway, and we never did, because actually I think the system has failed him so badly. But we won't be silent about it, because I believe that it is the silence about bullying that leads to that avoidable harm. So just to conclude, the radicalisation elements are that these skeptics have been drawn in by the claim of fighting cults. They've been indoctrinated online, persuaded to fight to protect a group that they perceive that doesn't include us newcomers. They've become part of an authoritarian and controlling group, and they're trying to destroy those who are actually exposing the cult. And my last slide is just to show basically how the radicalisation elements match up with our course of conduct and what the effects are. And we feel that it's important to realise that this group of rationalists are very well organised, they're global, and they're very big players in developing what's called social proof. Because when you don't know what news to trust, it all becomes about, well, people trust this guy. And these are the people that people trust. So there you go, that's the end of our talk. Thank you for listening. So I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone dares to ask more.
So the philosophical differences about Steiner that you have with this group, I'm not clear.
There aren't any.
Yeah.
We're completely in agreement.
So
that's what's so weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
Why did they attack us?
How could they evaluate you without you sitting with them in a proper assessment for mental health?
Well, there's no evaluation.
In that case, there's just name calling.
Unfortunately. But the thing is, the risk diagnosis, I mean, it's a clever course of conduct, because when you say that somebody's dangerous, that's the best way to get people. I mean, the reality of it is, if I had the condition that they went into court and swore they believed I had that, first of all, would they take the house of somebody that was severely mentally ill? Come on. And secondly, if I did have that condition, which is known to be the trigger for the risk that's associated with it, is being rejected, I would be dead, clearly. So it's a very cynical exercise to say, for us to know that we know that they're lying, but they've taken our home away from us.
How were they able to do that?
Because the court awarded it. By leaving out the harassment,
yeah.
It only left a case in defamation, and that is a very expensive form of legal, course of action. And then the judge, blamed us for talking about what they were doing, whilst he just refused to look at their covert course of conduct. But you see, the internet makes it so easy to have a discussion. What you're seeing on the internet, I mean, a lot of people, I feel sorry for them. Anybody who believes that we don't believe anything we see, obviously. It's a democratizing medium. No, it's not. It's a medium that is completely stage managed. Completely.
Yeah.
So we now, we publish very strongly, but it doesn't really matter what we publish. So many people have been warned about us. I mean, it's enormous. To try and get out from underneath that is really, really hard. But when we discovered about this boy, and now he's a young man, I mean, it's really so sad that it all came from this original refusal to look at what had actually
And get
gone
him
on.
proper treatment. Yeah.
Our children have had to watch us be publicly humiliated for years because of the fact that we stood up for them. There must be a part of them that think, Mum and Dad, why did you do that?
Yeah.
But when we tell them what this boy has now gone on to do, I think they'll understand that, you know, it must be worth standing against bullying. I mean, really, that is what we will continue to do.
It's necessary.
It is. It's tough,
Yeah.
but it, you know, it has to be done. Thank you very much.
You're
I've got
welcome.
through that.
What is your strengths during all these trials?
Well, I think it's the fact that we have each other. I mean, that's a really good point. I don't think if it had been one of us, I really don't think we'd have been able to cope. I mean, the feeling that you just need to run away. I mean, all what happened during my mum's death of being like mobbed and knowing that people were stalking us. I mean, it was absolutely atrocious. I don't know why we managed, but I do think that we did a lot. We do comedy. We do comedy stuff, you know, and laughter is really, and also because we're prepared to look at it, and we knew that it was. You know, I don't have an answer for you, but it isn't easy. And I don't think I've made it look easy either, but
No,
it's terrifying.
Yeah.
And what's terrifying to me is the fact that the government has rewarded this, that the courts has rewarded this behaviour. Yeah, and also, sorry.
But if you keep explaining your position, at least there'll be some challenge to the.
Yeah, it's really
sense.
important because the thing is, you know, I don't have a mental health condition. In fact, you know, I was a self-defense trainer. I'm a double black belt Aikido, which before I was more disabled, I used to enjoy those things. And you know, I've got I'm a kind of democratic socialist. You know, I do think that by getting things out, and I think this is the way to go with the all extremism. We must deconstruct it. We have to dismantle these ideas, and it must annoy them so much that I'm calmly putting out the facts, and I will continue to do that because what they want me to do, and of course I did when my mother was dying. I actually did. It was so distressing to me. But now I think the best thing to do is to formulate theory and disseminate it, and that's what I'll be doing. Well, we will, won't we? Thank you.